Chapter 28. The Lost Woods. The path through the forest was serene, an almost total contrast to the fortifications that monsters had built at the foot of the tower on the wood's edge. Zelda and Paya walked in the dappled sunlight, the boughs of the trees above them rustling in the wind. Birdsong rang throughout the woods. In the distance, Zelda saw a number of deer grazing. They noticed her, lifted their heads, were very still, and then kept walking, as if they had judged her not a threat. After the violence of clearing out the monsters, the serenity of these woods, not even in the Lost Woods proper, was like a physical object laid over her awareness. She would not say she felt at peace, exactly. The adrenaline was still pumping. She could still hear the bokoblins shouting and the eruptions of bombs that sent many of them flying into the muck from which they never emerged. Still, this place was peaceful. Based on her demeanor, Paya seemed to feel the same. She was, as far as Zelda could tell, no longer taking in the environment as a series of places where they might be attacked from off-lead. The quiet of the woods was reflected in Paya's face, the genuine relaxation of her features, the smoothness of her brow. The Shaker woman removed her hat, letting it hang against her back. Zelda pulled her own hood back, too. The air here was cool and sweet. She was still wearing her Hylian tunic. The ancient armor that Robbie and Jaren's machine had produced seemed remarkably resilient, and after conferring with Mija she had concluded that it would resonate with any weapons made by similar means, but she'd had no real occasion to wear it yet. Yes, she could have donned it to clear the monster encampment, or in a dozen other places as they had made their way back down Akala and across the foot of the Death Mountain range, but none of it felt right. There was a weight to the armor, more than just the fact of its mass. That made her think she should test it somewhere important. Most of the time the two of them only sought to avoid conflict. Wouldn't donning the armor and using the frighteningly powerful, frankly, weaponry forged in the ancient oven be an intrinsic escalation, an invitation to greater violence? Perhaps she was not ready for that yet. But then, perhaps that was an excuse. It was easy to frame an avoidance of violence as a principled stand, instead of one couched in fear. These were the thoughts she was dwelling on as the mist rolled in. In one moment, the day was clear, and by looking one could see for hundreds of meters in every direction. The next, every space was filled with mist, and that mist with floating, dancing lights, like fireflies or fairies, but less substantial than those, less physically real. For a moment she thought to reach out and touch one of those dancing lights that left faint trails of luminescence hanging in their wake, and then she snapped back to the real world as the coolness of the mist kissed her skin. "Hiya," she said, drawing her hood up. "I think we have reached the Lost Woods." Paya put her hat back on, looked around them, then shook her head. I disagree." "You do?" "Why, yes. I've never been to the Lost Woods, but this isn't how they've been described to me. The trees there are different. The air is different. They say one cannot even see the sky there, and that the spirits of the wood are always at your elbow, waiting to lead you astray." Zelda was about to protest these details, to point at the thickness of the fog, when Pi pointed at their feet. "We are still on a path. Should we choose, we could simply turn around and follow it out of the forest. As hard as this is to see, I don't think we're in the Lost Woods proper." That was true. And, well, what did it matter, anyway? If they weren't there, they soon would be. "Regardless," Zelda said, "please stay close to me." And Paya did. The path led them through a crevasse of stone, which the entire wood seemed to funnel into, and Zelda thought that perhaps anyone walking into the forest would eventually find their way here, guided by the geometry of the land itself. She kept checking over her shoulder, to make sure that Paya was still behind her, and it was a relief that Paya never really reacted to this inspection, and instead just walked closer to Zelda. Zelda thought about asking Paya to hum, or sing, but she had an image of walking along listening to Paya's voice and then turning to speak to her, only to find that the voice was coming from nowhere and Paya was gone. No, she would just keep checking, the way she'd been doing. The crevasse opened up as they came to the roofless ruins of an old house, or, at least she thought it was a house. Two of the walls were missing, and if there had been a roof then the flames rising from the two braziers in the center of the floor would have undoubtedly set it ablaze. Embers rose from the charcoal and oil-treated wood, dancing in the air before being swept away by the wind, out through the gap left by one of the missing walls. She followed the trail with her eyes, watching as the embers faded in the mist, drifting in the direction of another brazier standing alone in the middle of the woods. It was only by the light of its fire that she knew it was there. What were you told at the stables? Again? She didn't really need to ask, but she did need to hear it. Paya was looking in the same direction she was, eyes locked on the glow of the fire in the distance. That the embers would lead us on the true path, toward our goal. Let us follow them, then. No, they had not been in the lost woods before, Zelda realized as they stepped outside of those ruined walls. Only now, had they entered the true domain of the forest spirits. The mean of the trees was different. That word, mean, pushed its way to the front of her thoughts. When she saw them out of the corner of her eye, she had a childish thought. When she looked directly at them, she realized that childishness did not preclude being true. The trees had faces in their trunks, places where the bark split into leering eyes, where the trunks pulled back into wide, laughing mouths. They were very still. Of course they were still. They were trees, but it was the stillness of having been caught in an act, as if they were playing a game, of which she was the object. They followed the sparks to a second brazier, then to a third, a fourth, on and on, walking quietly through the woods, hushed not by a sense of danger, but of strangeness. As frightening as the faces on the trees were, they did not convey a sense of malice, only a strange, bouncing humor. And further out, past the crackling of the fires, the gentle blowing of the wind, the animals who sometimes crossed the path of the two women, there is something else. Zelda remembered at the peak of Mount Lanayru how much she had seen and heard that Paya could not see and hear. "Do you hear them?" she asked of her companion. I don't know what you mean," Paya said, which meant she could not. She halted then, gently lay her fingertips on Paya's temples. "With your permission, I would open your senses, so you and I may see the same things when we reach our destination." Paya, scarlet, only nodded. Zelda placed a sliver of the power directly into Paya's thoughts, just enough to match the amount she'd drawn when first she saw the quarks. She stepped back, and Paya blinked, looked around, and shivered. "Oh, and no, I hadn't heard that before." "Don't be afraid of them," Zelda said. It seemed a foolish thing to say on its own, so she continued. "I spoke with them when I freed Nature. They are very kind, and don't mean any harm." "As you say." Paya inclined her head in acquiescence, though she was still visibly uncomfortable as they walked deeper into the woods, surrounded by what sounded like the distant laughter of children. After being led in so many directions that even Paya utterly lost her sense of where they were or where they'd been, they came to a pair of braziers standing together. A torch, and lit they against the body of one. Zelda and Paya stood between the two, beside each, just a ways off, and looked around. Nothing. There were no other braziers, least of all in the direction that the sparks were flowing. Zelda took the torch in her hand, considered for a moment, and lit it in one of the fires. Paya watched as she held it aloft, and the embers danced through the air. "It seems we will have to make our own way, now." Now the going was slower, the wind picking up, but that wind did not dispel the mist that pressed in from between the trees, the mist that was barely pushed back at all by the light of the fire. Zelda looked down at her feet, saw how the long, rich grass flowed in the same direction as the embers, and reflected that if the torch were to go out, they could probably still find their way. The laughter was louder, now, and less distant. There was still no malice there. If anything, the children of the forest seemed excited by their progress. Still, the mist was thick, and she knew that if they went off the path, or were separated by more than meters, then they would be lost, and finding each other again would be a thorny problem indeed. "Paya," she said, stopping and turning and trying not to sigh with relief when she saw the other woman was still there. "We are drawing near, I think, but the risk of us being separated is growing sharper. Hold on to me, and do not let go until I say so." Later she would reflect that this was not wholly fair to put on Paya, that she could have taken that initiative for herself. She tried her best in the moment, offering her hand. Paya looked at her, then her hand, nodded, and slipped her palm against Zelda's. The shaky girl's grip was firm and strong, though Zelda could feel Paya's heart pounding through her fingertips. The princess led her attendant deeper and deeper into the lost woods. Malice spewed out in a geyser as the master sword scored an opening against Ganon's chest, and Link dipped below and around the flow, bringing the sword up in another cut that would have opened the calamity from its thigh to its armpit. Ganon's sword lashed out, smashing against the blade of Evil's bane, and the impact sent a shockwave up Link's arm. A hand easily larger than his head reached for him, fingers twitching as if to crush a skull, and he ducked under it, bringing the sword up again, cutting into the inside of Ganon's elbow. The Calamity roared, bringing its own weapon down, and Link leapt away as if dancing, feet barely touching the ground as the malice-soaked blade smashed into the floor. Link stopped just outside of Ganon's reach, turning to face it again, both hands wrapped around the Master Sword's hilt. The beast watched him with burning eyes, stuttered, growled with a sound deeper and more terrible than the rumbling of the earth or sky. How many times had he done this? How many times had he experienced this precise moment? 4 times? 5 now? He was losing track. How many hours had it been? Hylia, had it been days? His arms would barely obey him, his fingers nearly fused into place and his legs shaking with a fatigue so intense he didn't know how to stop it. The Calamity sniffed at the air, as if scenting his weakness. Fine. Let it think him weak. It didn't matter. Zelda was coming. The sword had told him. Zelda was coming, and with her she would bring the champions, and together they would put an end to this. Together. The Calamity roared, rising to its full height again, and raised its sword. He moved with all of his strength, squeezing speed and surety out of limbs that insisted they had none left. Before the beast had even raised its weapon, he thrust the blade of the Master Sword into the soft flesh just above its groin. It made a high, terrible sound as its sword fell out of its hands, and then he tore the Master Sword up, sideways, out. There was a torrent of malice and blood and fire, and this too he danced away from as Ganon fell to its knees, and then to its hands. Its innards, so different from the insides of a living thing yet still analogous, poured onto the floor between its limbs. Its massive, horned head turned to face him, eyes still glowing, and it opened its mouth as if to show him the forest of fangs that it kept hidden there. It lunged for him with its teeth. He stepped easily around it, scoring its left eye with the sword. The beast howled as he took 2 more steps, standing in its blind spot as it writhed, and then he brought the Master Sword down on the back of Ganon's neck. The Calamity's head hit the ground, its impact shaking the floor. The body followed moments after, its shoulder catching on one of the twisted horns. The tree-like legs kicked, seeking purchase, as if to rise, and the arms unbelievably reached, the right for Ganon's sword and the left for Link. He lashed out with the Master Sword, and 2 of Ganon's severed fingers fell to the ground before him. The arm fell. The body collapsed. Blood and malice pooled on the ground as if a reservoir had been opened. He stood, waiting, stance orthodox, controlling his breathing, ready for it to rise again, and then all of it, head and body and fingers and sword, burst into flame. He did not lower the sword. He turned his back on the beast, taking steps away as boiling miasma flowed out from it, reaching up to the ankles of his boots. It did not burn, as if it did not touch him at all. He took the position he knew he must take, to be ready if Ganon were to try to flee this place in the moments to come. To be prepared for when the beast rose again, because it would rise, again and again and again, never truly dying until it was finally sealed away. The fire coalesced into a burning darkness, and out of this darkness stared eyes, dozens of them, then hundreds, then 2. The last few times they had reached this point, Ganon had been conversational, mocking, lying, seeking weakness. Now, though, it did not speak. It only laughed. Link sank to one knee, waiting as the Calamity gathered its power, waiting for the tide of darkness. He would not fall. Zelda was coming. The mist receded all at once, replaced by clarity and an upwelling of light. Zelda extinguished the torch, placing it back into her pack as they entered the Korok forest. She had thought she understood what a forest was, only a day ago. In fact, she had thought she understood what a forest was when she hunted boar between the trees of the Great Plateau. Walking through the Lost Woods had not changed that understanding. The differences were down to its being a fey place, a place where the children of the wood made home in tricks and games and artifice, so that deviations from her understanding could be compartmentalized, rationalized, reasoned away. Now Zelda saw that she was but a child, seeing the world with her own eyes for the first time. The Korok forest was bursting with life, so intense and so pervasive that she did not need the goddess's power to see the lines of vitality running through that place. Ancient trees as big as houses spread out of the ground at irregular, insistently organic intervals, and their boughs shook with the weight of leaves and light that they bore. Pools of clear water stood in places through the wood, and out of these waters rose plants she did not recognize, covered in seed pods that glowed with a gentle light that would make it easy to navigate in this place even when the sun was down. There were flowers here she had never seen before, and enormous roots running back to a tree so colossal that she stopped and stared in awe for long moments before remembering herself, remembering Paya, remembering their shared purpose. How long it took to drag her eyes from its mighty limbs, that reached out so far that they must have hovered over the edge of the lost woods itself. How long it took her to realize that there was more here, that there were invisible things that she could not see unless she opened herself completely. Then her eyes fell on the pedestal where, once, a sword had stood at rest. She walked to it, stood on that raised platform, surrounded by blue flowers that brought tears to her eyes, though she did not know why. Only then, in that place, before the spot where the master's sword had been at home for its long centuries of sleep, did she release Pai's hand. "Princess," her attendant said, and she could feel the awe and the wonder and the complete lack of fear that Pai felt because it was in her, too. Paya was looking up at the enormous tree and Zelda's eyes followed hers. "I think we are not alone." What a thing to say! Who could stand in this place and believe themselves alone? Who could believe that they would ever truly be alone, ever again, so confronted with the intensity and insistence of life? But then the tree began to move. It was the size of a castle keep, and more, and its bark unquestionably thicker than she was tall, so that the sound it made as it shifted was like wood bending, not quite cracking. Was she a fool, to think it looked like it had a face? Brows of darker colored bark drew up and apart from each other, not quite revealing the place where the tree's eyes would have been. It shifted, and she saw that more bark of the same color stretched across that face. At the tree, forming what looked like a mustache hanging over a lower lip and strong chin, and these set beneath a long, broad nose. A rudimentary face, in its way, but on the staggering scale of the tree it gave the impression of looking up at a slowly awakening god. The tree gave no outward sign that it had turned its attention on her. She felt its focus, like a weight of warmth and coolness, like the surety of solid ground. She thought to draw on the power, but in that moment knew that she could not. "Ah," the tree said, "you have finally arrived, Princess of Hyrule. I have been waiting for a long time." Waiting. It was all she could manage. The strangeness of the world was not so strange to her, and the ancient spirit of this place, because it was ancient, she could feel its power and its age coursing through the air and the brush, and highly it was so much of the forest, was in some ways no stranger than Najdra or Dinral. Still, that it knew she was come and spoke to some deep-seated part of her. "Yes," the tree said. "Forgive me. I am the guardian of these woods. In times past, some have called me the Deku Tree." As the Deku Tree spoke, the forest began filling with a sound like tiny bells jingling. Zelda looked up, and something inside of her blossomed with warmth as her expectations were met. The Koroks were peeking from behind the roots of trees, floating down from the sky on their spinning flowers, jumping on top of rocks to stare at her with naked curiosity. "The Koroks, the children of the forest, have decided to call me their father." "Great Deku Tree," she said, bowing, "we are thankful for your gracious reception. Though we are here by the invite of the Koroks, we were not prepared for the beauty or the quiet of these woods." "Eh? No more of that," he said, gentle but firm. "The women of the royal family have never stood on ceremony with the children of the forest, and I would not have you be the first." She stopped, blinked, stood straight, looked at Pai, who could offer her nothing. Being in the presence of this power was nearly too much for the other woman. Zelda thought it was like being in the middle of a legend. Zelda turned her attention back to the Deku Tree, raised her face to look up at his. "Have you known my family for very long?" "You could say that." An amused warmth beneath that, punctuated by peals of delighted laughter from a small handful of the Koroks. "So long as the royal family has stood in the name of the goddess, Hylia, so too has the forest stood with the royal family. I was the guardian of the sword that seals the darkness, for the millennia where it waited for the hand that would draw it. A century and more ago, I was here when it was pulled free." Yes, of course he would have been. Of course, the hero had come here in the days before he had been called that, answering the call that was demanded by his strength and his courage. It was only natural. Probably the Koroks had been visible to him, and he had been received warmly. Still, the question came to mind, forcing itself forward, because she had to hear more. She had to know. "You met Link?" "I met him, yes. I watched over him as he was tested and found worthy, too. He stood where you are standing now, before the pedestal that held the sword. I remember that moment clearly, as if I were still watching it happen. I think that, if you wanted, you could remember that moment too. What? To recall a memory that was not hers, that didn't even make sense. Mighty is the memory etched by the awakening of the hero spirit. You have the awareness of the goddess. Reach out to the pedestal, touch the place where the sword met its master, and I am sure that you will be able to grasp hold of that moment as firmly as he did. She swallowed, realized that she was fearful because she believed. What am I afraid of? Of him? Of finding out what he felt? Of feeling as he did? The fullness of him? Of experiencing what it is like to be him? How terrible can understanding be? Pai's hand touched her shoulder. Her attendant said nothing. Would have thought it a terrible breach of rightness to say anything. She just nodded in a supportive affirmative. That note said, I will be here for you, no matter what happens. I will keep you anchored. She laid her hand on Pai's, squeezed at her fingers, gently lifted the hand away. She turned to face the setting where the master's sword had rested for thousands of years. Reaching inside of herself, grabbing hold of the molten light that was the power of her birthright, she found that she was shaking, not just her, the amnesiac, but also her, the princess, and her, the oracle of the goddess. The very foundation of everything she stood upon quaked, her soul set to rumbling in her frame. Every fiber of her wanted this, every fiber of her twisted in fear of it. Zelda reached out with the power of Hylia, feeling at the absence of the sword. She remembered. From the north, Link stepped back into the clearing before the Deku Tree. The Koroks followed him in a dancing train, singing nonsense songs and laughing and waving sticks around, having mock fights with one another. They mimicked him. He saw there were little flourishes to their movements, here and there, that reminded him of recruits trying to copy the way he held a sword and shield. The Koroks seemed more successful, almost. He smiled at them as they danced around and away from his legs, and they whooped and hollered and ran ahead in their strange, turning walk. I see that you have returned. The Deku Tree's voice was soft and controlled, but Link had been around him for long enough now to recognize that the spirit was pleased, even happy. Its enormous eyebrows gathered together and lowered, suggesting deep thought and consternation as Link stepped onto the platform where he had first spoken to the Guardian days ago. Based on the demeanor of your stalwart companions, may I assume that you were successful? The Koroks answered before he could. Yeah. You should have seen it. He had his sword, and it was like, wham! Everything went flying. And he won. He won. Mr. Hero! Mr. Hero! Mr. Hero! And they chanted that name for him as a body, the hundreds of them singing his praises as if he had stepped out of a storybook. He nodded up at the Deku Tree. Anything he said would have been unheard over the voices of the Koroks. I am glad. The Deku Tree said so loudly that the cheers of the Koroks slowly receded. That you are victorious. In every era, the trial undertaken by the one who would hold the sword that seals the darkness is unique to the searcher. That you have overcome this is proof of your mettle. Tell me, though, did you find this challenge trying? In answer, he held up the remains of his weapon, the hilt of a sword, finely wrought, carried by those servants of the royal family who had risen above their knighthood. The crossguard and grip were good, solid steel, the grip wrapped in leather and the cross laid with gold leaf that had been blasted apart. The hilt surviving had been a surprise. In the moment, the blade itself had shattered so totally that its shards had fallen on the ground like raindrops. So, a trial that demanded you use the fullness of your strength. Good. Those are the only trials that we can trust. The Koroks cheered again, apparently at nothing except for the fact that Link and the Deku Tree were talking, and the Guardian of the Forest waited for their high-pitched roar to subside. Still, now you are without the means to defend yourself. A hush fell, nearly total, and the Koroks grew very still, as if they had taken root. Link looked back at them, but none of them moved, only the twitching of their leafy faces gave any impression that they were alive at all. That you were able to find your way here it all spoke to your potential before we ever met. You are an accomplished knight, who in any other era would be the pride of his kingdom. But there are times that the world demands more than mere accomplishment. Darkness is rising again, Ganon's power is seeping back into the world. The monsters that rise from this day forward shall make the small incursions that the royal army now faces seem like nothing at all, in comparison. If things progress as they are, Ganon will return. The wind blew gently through the boughs of the trees in the clearing, bringing to Link the smell of the lost woods, of the plains beyond. Was his horse still waiting for him, he wondered? Surely the rest of his unit was tending to it well. They'd had orders to wait for 2 weeks. It had not been even half that time. Would they be waiting for him, at the castle? Waiting for news of what was to come? Since you arrived here, you have proven yourself the possessor of a hero's portion of power, of wisdom, and of courage. But, heed me now, Link, child of Hyrule. At the shift in the Deku Tree's tone, Link stood straighter, set his shoulders back, looked up. All of these, even gathered together, are as nothing. They are proof of what you can do, but the question of what you can do is unimportant, meaningless, in comparison to what you are willing to do. You might be strong enough to move mountains, wise enough to know when to use your strength, and courageous enough to face down the doom of nations unblinking, but none of that will avail you or the world unless you are willing to act. The sun shining through the trees placed the Master Sword at the bottom of a tilted shaft of light. The dark blue, almost purple, of its hilt reflected that light with a luster that he could compare to no material he'd ever seen. The yellow jewel set in its hilt, likewise. More than those, however, he found himself staring at the blade. It was steel, or he thought it was, but it was more than that. He had been unsure when he first arrived in the forest, but looking at it now he was certain the blade glowed with a light it could barely contain. That light was the promise of the sword. The Master Sword is not a weapon. It may be used as a weapon, and the enemy knows it as a weapon, but at its heart it is more than that. It is the very soul of the hero. By drawing it, you will be taking on the weight of the hero's burden. Every person in Hyrule and beyond will live and die by your ability to bear it. Thus has it been for every hero throughout ages and counted, since the dawning of time. Here, only here, did Link pause. The king, and the princess herself, had seen his company off in their quest for the sword. He remembered the gravity of the king's eyes, and the forlorn hope in the princess's. She had seemed so sad, he thought, and at the time he had wondered why. In fact, he still did. Did she have no faith that they would bring back the sword? Did she fear that destiny would cheat the kingdom, the world, of its defender as she had been cheated of her birthright? She had never looked directly at him, then, her eyes taking in the expedition all at once, but still he felt her regard. The world, the Deku Tree had said. Everyone and everything. Every Hylian, and Zora, and Goron, and Gerudo, and Rito, and Korok, and Bon, and Horse, and Deer. Every spirit of the land. Their hopes were invested in this sword, in what it represented. Could he possibly hold such a thing? Never mind the soul of the hero. He didn't care about that. Not really could he presume to shoulder the hopes of all those people. Could he bear the weight of their souls, too? What will he do, Link? The Deku Tree's question presumed no answer. Princess Zelda's eyes were still in his mind, looking down at him, around him, as he rode away from the castle. She was waiting for his return, for the hope he could bring. He stepped forward, wrapped his hand around the Master Sword's hilt. There was a surge inside of him, the sword reaching out to him, the vastness of its power crashing against him, as if seeking his worthiness. Link pulled the sword free, and there was lightning in his hands. He held it aloft, and the Koroks were still, and the Deku Tree sighed, relieved of a long-held anxiety. And a voice whispered in the corners of his mind, "Greetings, Master Link." Link came to with a gasp. Why had he thought of that, just now? How long ago had that been? The chamber of the Calamity's prison rumbled with the force of the power of the beast, making the floor shake beneath Link from his place where he kneeled on the floor. It had not fled in the moment of his reminiscence. It was still there, gathering power, preparing to try to kill him. But, no, it was smiling, too, in the folds of the burning darkness that composed its silhouette. "Dreaming, are you?" Ganon whispered, its whisper shaking the foundations of the earth. "Am I boring you now, Oe? Are you growing complacent, or—" And here it chuckled, and its mouth was like that of a man. No spirit, no demon could make a sound that cruel. "Are you finally reaching your limit?" Its power gathered to it, bubbling and hissing and burning and crackling, the darkness at the heart of the chamber growing so intense that it hurt the eyes to look at. "Are you finally ready to surrender?" The power carried her along the paths of his memory, showing her the recesses of his awareness in ways she would never have thought possible. Was that an invasion? an evil thing, to have experienced his memory. He did not intend for me to see that moment, the amnesiac thought. He would have agreed to anything that would help me understand him and myself, the oracle rejoined. He thought of me. The princess said in that shared space where one woman was three, however tenuous the separation between them had grown, and the whole of Zelda stopped to reflect on this knowledge. He was there. She had felt his mind through memory, and in that infinite space she could feel him, not separated by physical distance, but by the interminable gap between any two souls. He was there. He was resting. The strain of battle was on him, layered on top of itself over and over and over like geological strata burying the body of the past, and she did not understand how he would bear that weight. Can I help him? Can I lend him my strength? I must let him know he is not alone. Zelda reached for the hero across that infinite space, seeking, hoping. His legs nearly collapsed under him as Link hauled himself to his feet, but still he stood, the Master Sword in both of his hands. He raised the sword that sealed the darkness, and its blade flared with its own power bolstered by the strength of his will. He breathed and found that it did not relieve him at all. Every movement of his chest a gasp that did not dispel the feeling of drowning. His arm shook, and he held the Master Sword aloft. Ganon roared, and the darkness rolled out with a sound like thunder, and it washed over Link and through him, and the pain was indescribable, and he screamed with the whole of his body as the hatred of Hyrule's ancient enemy sought to tear him to pieces, as it had so many times before. No part of it was different, no part of it had changed. Except that he met it standing. She touched Link's mind in the same instant that the calamity sought to destroy him. The malice did not touch her. Ganon did not sense her. She merely brushed against the surface of Link's thoughts, hoping to strengthen him, reassure him, and as she did so she was struck with the full force of the pain that he felt in that moment. She was not prepared. She could not even process it. She was sent hurtling from the place of her power, back to her physical body, which collapsed on the dais where the Master Sword had stood at rest. Zelda was asleep on a bed of leaves, not a pile of leaves but an actual bed, mattress and sheets and blanket and frame, all constructed of leaves. Paya had had her concerns, but after testing it herself had found it both sound and comfortable beyond what she would have assumed possible. The Korok responsible for it was asleep while standing on a stump not very far away. A smaller, narrower bed had been set up next to Zelda's somewhat larger one. "I made that one just for you," the sleepy Korok had said. "The Deku Tree said Miss Princess would be traveling with someone, so I wanted to make sure you'd be comfortable too." Paya sat, watching the light fading outside of the Deku Tree. Torches lit the interior to a degree bright enough to allow easy, safe movement, but dim enough to not interfere with the princess's rest. Other Koroks stood in other nooks, surrounded by piles of fruit or mushrooms or even arrows, but Paya paid them no mind for now. There was no harm to be feared from the Korok forest, of this she had been convinced. She only had to be wary of memory, and, perhaps, of herself. Her hands were shaking too much to write in her diary. She kept thinking of how Zelda had looked, for that one moment before she fell. The extremity of the pain written on her face. Even the Deku Tree had been shocked, the Koroks had flown into a panic. She'd carried her princess here, inside the trunk of the Deku Tree, at the heart of the safest place in all Hyrule. For all that safety can even mean, she thought to herself. She might sleep less than usual tonight. So, she sat in silence, listening to the crackling of the fire, the mumbling of the sleeping Korok, and always watching Zelda. The princess had a bruise on one cheek from where she'd fallen forward, and her color had not fully recovered to its normal hue, but she looked completely peaceful, almost as if the episode outside had never happened. In the distance she heard someone begin playing on an instrument, a woodwind with a high, clear sound. She did not know the song, but she stopped and listened to it anyway. It was not sad, exactly, but nostalgic, slow, hinting that there was sadness to come. That sadness might be part of everything, but that in this moment, here, now, there was peace. "Paya," Zelda said, and Paya nearly jumped to her feet, but Zelda's voice said she was half dreaming. "What is that? That music?" Kaya stopped, considered, tried to pick out the particulars of the sound, weighed it against what she knew of the stories about music played by the forest children.
I think it is an ocarina. My mother used to sing me that song,
Zelda said, and then she drifted to sleep again. Kaya stared at her. Then she looked out into the night, listening to the high, soothing tones. The night passed quietly, and eventually she took her rest. End of chapter.